Alrighty, so this week we are talking all about reproduction, and it might not be what you think. Some misconceptions is that reproduction always involves penises and vaginas. I want to sort of open your world up and help you to understand that that is not what reproduction is. Reproduction is just a method by which organisms make more of themselves, and it actually does not always involve sex. Okay, just lagging a bit. Okay, so there are several strategies that you can employ as an organism to achieve reproduction, which, according to the selfish gene, is the entire purpose of life. So, what are the strategies? There is sexual reproduction, and there is also asexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction is simply the mixing of DNA. That's all it is. There are forms of sexual reproduction in which there is no penis or vagina involved. So sexual intercourse is the contact of individuals involving penetration, usually with a penis and vagina. This right here is what you all are used to thinking of when you think of sexual reproduction, but there are other ways of doing it, which we'll learn about. And then so there's asexual reproduction. Asexual simply means without sex. If you look at that word, asexual, A means without. So that is without sex. You are able to make more of yourself, and that is basically cloning. All right, so there are different types of sex. Now, sex does not always have to accompany reproduction. In fact, two organisms are capable of mixing their DNA, therefore having sex, without actually producing offspring. And so this type of sex is called conjugation. It's probably the simplest form of sex in the entire living world. And that is when two bacteria or any single-celled organism, protist or bacteria, can actually trade DNA. And so here you can see a red plasma here, and perhaps this plasma carries antibiotic resistance. It is capable of cloning that gene or that plasmid and scooching it on over to its neighbor through a cytoplasma bridge. That is a very simple form of sex. And again, this is not reproduction. This is simple sex. Sex as simple as it gets. Mixing of DNA. And then, of course, there's intercourse, and this is what we are used to thinking of when we think of sexual reproduction. And it usually involves a penis and a vagina. And here you can see, if you look closely, this is probably the most extreme version of this phenomenon in the animal kingdom. And here you can see the duck's penis right there. And so you might be asking yourself, why is it all curly? Well, I'll show you. So just sit back, relax, and learn about duck penises.
I discovered that they have this incredibly dramatic erection. In a third of a second, the male averts a 20-centimeter long penis and ejaculates. And this is something that was certainly not known and that nobody would have guessed in a million years. The next question that popped into my mind was, I wonder what the females look like. Because you can't have a penis like that without having something going on in the female. And when I dissected them, I almost fell off my chair, literally, because there it was, this incredible labyrinth of structures in the vagina. And when we look at the histology of the female ducks, we can see that the females have much thicker vaginal walls. And so essentially they have reinforced their vaginas in order to be able to withstand these ballistic penises without rupturing, which is, of course, important if you're a female duck. And so we emailed somebody who works on ducks for the industry, more the commercial side of it. We said, have you ever seen these weird structures? And he wrote back and he said, wow, I cannot believe it. This is, this has been here all along, obviously. But the way he would dissect the females, he would always just skip through, right? Whereas the way I was dissecting it was, I was unwrapping it because I figure I got to see what's underneath. And so I just couldn't believe it. But it was, I think, in part because I was coming in as a woman and I was asking a question that to me seemed pretty obvious, right? And it just apparently hadn't been obvious to anybody else up until then.
So basically what's going on here is there is a co-evolution. Very, very bizarre, very interesting. So I don't know if you've ever watched ducks, but they are very aggressive when they mate. The males tend to be very aggressive towards the females, pretty much against their will. They have sex with them. And it gets aggressive to the point of often harming the female. And so in the past, the female has had very little choice in who she is mixing her DNA with, and that's not good for the sexual selection of a population. And so what's happened over time is the female has combated these assertive males by evolving a vagina that has a corkscrew shape, like a maze. I'm sorry about my dog in the background. So this corkscrew maze of a vagina is like a lock, and the penis of the male cannot get into that lock unless the female changes the orientation of her vagina to allow the male penis in. So, of course, the female has evolved a lock-like vagina. The male has evolved a lock pick. And so it's a arms race between the male penis and the female vagina, going back and forth through time, that have created these extremely elaborate reproductive systems. A co-evolution arms race, a really good example. So that's intercourse, which is what we are most familiar with when it comes to sex and reproduction. Next, another type of sexual reproduction. You might not think when you see a honeybee landing on a flower that flower is having sex. That is sex. When you see an insect landing on a flower, you are watching sex of plants. And so right here we have an angiosperm, which is a type of plant that is capable of pollination. It has attracted this honeybee, which we just became familiar with, or will be familiar with, depending on what year this is. This is the honeybee, and it's carrying pollen with it. It's drawn to the flower through nectar, and the flower is depositing with these little male parts here. It is depositing pollen onto this honeybee. This honeybee, however, cannot get enough nectar from one flower. It must go to another one and deposit, by accident, deposit some of its pollen there. And so what this is doing is allowing the flower, which can't move on its own, to move its gametes around. If you're a flower, you can't get up and walk around. You can't go to the flower next door and reproduce. You need a middleman, and that's what the honeybee is. The honeybee is like the postman delivering plant sperm, basically. Pollen is plant sperm. Okay, so another one, and this typically happens underwater, although technically speaking, I guess pollination is also this. But external fertilization is when you have an external release of sperm, and here you can see this, I believe this is a sea anemone of some sort. It's externally fertilizing. Another great example, and one that's very applicable in my life, is clams. Clams do this as well. And they will ejaculate when there's a sudden change in water temperature, and this is shocking their system. Basically, they believe that the seasons have changed, and so they will ejaculate to try to keep up with their internal cycles. They need to reproduce during a certain time of year. So what breeders will do is they'll rapidly change the temperature of the water, and that makes the clams ejaculate, and then the females release their eggs. And it's just a game of chance. You have a whole bunch of eggs floating around with a whole bunch of sperm, and the hope is that they will meet, but it's random. You don't... Oh my God, my dog. Sammy! Hey! You're rude. You're rude. Thank you. Sorry about that. So anyway, external fertilization, you're kind of just hoping that an egg will meet a sperm. And it's random if it does or doesn't. Okay, so next interesting type of sexual reproduction is hermaphrodites. Hermaphrodites have both male and female parts. Now, the ways that they reproduce are vast. So, for example, flowers are actually hermaphrodites. They have male and female parts. But there are so many ways that hermaphrodites reproduce. Here's a really interesting one. Between two slugs.
So all these animals, having left the sea, solved the problems of moving around and breathing air in their own differing ways. But there was another difficulty: mating. In the sea, animals need only release their eggs and sperm, and the water mix the two together. On dry land, that couldn't happen, even for the most moisture-loving of creatures. An individual slug carries both male and female organs, but even then, that was of no help. Each had to both give and receive. Somehow or other, pairs of individuals had to get together, and the ways they have evolved in which to do so are quite extraordinary indeed. Some of them are almost beyond imagining. The leopard slug, you might think, has the simplest of habits. Maybe, but not when it comes to mating. When an individual is looking for a partner, it gives its trail of slime a special taste that advertises the fact. Another, if it feels the same way, will detect the invitation and start to follow. The pursuer, to confirm that it's there and ready to mate, gives the pursued a nibble. The leader heads upwards. An overhang is what's needed. The underside of a branch will do very nicely. The two start to circle one another more and more closely until they entwine.
So if you're lost here, I just want to remind you, they are both male and female. They are both hermaphrodites, meaning they both have penises or something like it, and they both have ovaries. So they're both male and female.
For an hour or so, they continue to wind themselves around one another. Then, suddenly, the pair release their hold on the branch and start to slide downwards on a rope of mucus. Now, in mid-air, they move to the next stage in their pairing. Each everts its male organ from just behind its head. These grow longer and longer.
So those translucent looking things growing out of their heads are penises, and they are going to basically mix sperm with that.
Then they too begin to entwine. They fan out to form a translucent, flower-like globe. And now, at last, sperm passes from one slug to the other. The transfer is complete. Each has been fertilized. Finally, their strange balletic relationship comes to an end.
Bye.
With a bump.
Anyway, so what they did there is they both, you can tell I like nerdy stuff. Look at my thumbnails. So they both traded sperm with each other and basically impregnated each other because they're both male and they are both female. So that's hermaphrodites. And the advantage of that is that there's a higher fecundity rate because both of them are getting impregnated. That's doubling the rate of reproduction, which is nice for them. Okay, so what are the advantages of sexual reproduction? So again, sexual reproduction is all about mixing DNA. When you mix DNA, you're actually going to increase genetic variation. Genetic variation is an absolute necessity if you're going to have any selective process for those individuals. If you have a bunch of babies and they're all the same, there's no way you can select the best one. There is no best one. If there is no sex, there is no best child. And if there is no best child, natural selection can't choose the best. And so natural selection doesn't work. You need variation as rule number one for natural selection. Without sex, organisms or populations of organisms have a hard time evolving to selective pressures. Take, for example, I believe they're black salamanders. I can't believe, or I can't remember what the name of the salamander is, but it's a black salamander. It actually exists in two forms. There is the sexually reproducing form and the asexual reproducing form. And they live in almost the same area. There was an experiment in which a pathogen was introduced. The sexual reproduction group was able to evolve while the asexual reproduction group was not. So sexual reproduction helps with evolution. Asexual reproduction has its advantages too. While it does not provide the same amount of genetic variation, it is faster and it is safer because it avoids interactions with other community members and it costs very little energy. Disadvantages. Sexual reproduction, you need gamete mobility. You need sperm and egg to meet each other. And the chances of that are sometimes astronomically low. Like, for example, if you are two clams on opposite sides of the ocean and a sperm and an egg have to meet, that'd be really hard to do. So you have to come up with a way of meeting each other. That's going to require energy, and it's going to require more exposure during the act, and you're going to be slower due to the need to find a mate. There's also, quite frequently, well, actually, in both cases, I guess, the females would go through a pregnancy, and that makes them more prone to predation as well. So these are all costs. And then asexual reproduction is lower genetic diversity, and that means populations are more vulnerable to selective pressures and less likely to adapt. So they both have their advantages, and they both have their disadvantages. So first of all, what reproductive strategy would be best for this flower here? This is a hermaphrodite. All flowering plants are hermaphrodites, meaning they have male and female parts. That means that they can technically reproduce with themselves. They could impregnate themselves, basically. So, what's better here, sexual or asexual? Well, of course, the answer in this situation is asexual because this flower has no neighbors. And its only option, therefore, is asexual reproduction. The numbers need to get up first before sexual reproduction is possible. So then, of course, what is the best reproductive strategy here? Sexual reproduction through either wind or, in this case, pollinators. They're going to come in, spread that pollen, and that's going to increase genetic variation, which allows evolution to take its course. Sometimes asexual selection gets creative, though. So we have here a redwood tree. Redwood trees are the tallest tree in the world, and they partly accomplish this through the growth of burls. So this is a burl. And what's interesting here is that this is sort of an exception. The burls of the redwood tree are purposely capable of mutating their own DNA. This increases genetic variation without sex. And so this is a strange example of asexual reproduction still leading to genetic variation. A very strange example. They can reproduce with cones, but they more frequently reproduce this way. All right, we'll get into this next time. So those are just some examples of reproduction, and we'll get into more detail later. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you next time.